And your name?
Hi, I'm Ivan Madeira, writer, director, and producer of Pattern. And Pattern is about set 5 months after the death of a man's wife during childbirth. And it's all about how he raises their baby Salome as a single father. And he becomes at a crossroads of how he wants to be able to raise the child in how they wanted to, in their vision together, basically. So that's the premise of the film and the journey of that few months after the death.
Now, this film took place in what town?
So set in Toronto in Canada, a place that, as you can hear from my accent, I'm originally from London, UK. And in 2017, I decided to emigrate to Toronto because I had connections to Canada from living there when in my 20s. And I was taking over my film career to Canada, and I started to write this film in 2019, and then the opportunity came to make it. And I said, I'm going to go for it and get the story out there.
That sounds good. I think the lead character who was featured was from, he had an accent from the Caribbean, or am I not correct in that?
I mean, yeah, all the characters, from my background, so I'm originally, my parents are from, my dad's from India, Goa, my mom's in the Philippines. And I grew up in London in a mixed environment, and I grew up a lot of people from the Caribbean and West Africa. And so when I was writing this story, there was people saying there's a strong connection between London, like slang and culture, because of the immigration in Toronto. So I wrote this story based on my experience in the UK, and you know, have to pay respect, and obviously, you know, going into the space, have to talk and engage the community, because I can't write the story without them being involved in influencing all of it, really. And so, yeah, to your point, Curtis is a heritage. He's Grenadian originally, or at least half Grenadian, half Jamaican. And I was taking influences from when I was casting the characters, so I can take the nuances of the Caribbean culture that could be in the film. So his partner Mia, her heritage is from Jamaica, so we wanted to sort of influence the Jamaican side of his dead wife, basically, one of the flashbacks, and then the small homages to the Grenadian side too. So that's the reason when we talked with the actors, and when they're younger selves, just, you know, freshly emigrated or like been in the country for a few years, want to make sure there was you know, references to the culture and to the accents too in some of the characters.
That's very interesting. Being raised by parents of the Caribbean myself, I understand the influences that the parents have on their sons and their daughters. In the movie, you had the mother and the mother-in-law who was very critical to their son's upbringing of his child, and wanted to influence that, for even from him moving into their home, or staying by himself, which he was very much trying to do on his own, which is very headstrong and very typical of a Black man who's from the Caribbean. So give me some insight as to the background from the mother's standpoint, and how they raised their sons during that time frame, because they knew when to step in and when to step out of the picture. Is that what you wanted to convey to your audience?
Yeah, and I think when we come into the picture, when the film starts, he had the moments when his mother and mother-in-law were helping him, you know, get through the initial like cloud of grief that he was in when his partner passed away. And then when he started to sort of slightly surface, slightly head above water just about, then he started to push away the help because he wanted to be, to raise the baby Salome in how him and his wife imagined. So when she was pregnant or before she was pregnant, they started to talk about their hopes and dreams for their child. So Curtis comes from more of a working class background in Toronto versus Mia, his wife, came from more middle upper class suburban background in the outskirts of Toronto, in the GTA, as it's called, the Greater Toronto Area. And I did want to make a commentary in class because I grew up in Britain, as you know. Well, we talk about class all the time in this country, and there's definitely an intersection between class and race. I mean, particularly my experience of growing up in London, seeing all the different cultures and classes, and the races all intersecting with that. So there's different sort of takes from the mother who's still working. She's still out there as a healthcare worker, and she can still retire, but she's still, part of her wants to work, needs to work, but also a big part of her wants to work. She can't not stop working. She cannot,
Right.
because it's conditioned in her. Versus the mother-in-law is retired. I mean, she had a fairly high-flying job, and so she's got more time and bandwidth. She worked hard, and she needs to let it settle, and she wants to basically use her money and I guess stature that feels that she can help her son-in-law and her granddaughter with more reach than Curtis's mother. So there's definitely headbuttings going there, and Curtis just wants to go, you know what, I've done well, Mum. Thank you for raising me. I've gotten to a position in my company, this company, where I want to be able to be my own man, be my own person. So that's really where his head's at, even though he is struggling with money because he's taken an unexpected blow, and there's, sometimes you just live within your means, even though you've got money. The buffer between the savings buffer can be somewhat limited. So he's kind of gone for his savings, and now he's struggling, but he wants to be like representing for his daughter, basically.
It was a very good film. I think that the pieces that really stood out to me was Curtis didn't have time to grieve. He had to quickly jump into the mode of being a father. He had to get his job situation correct. So he never got the opportunity to grieve the death of his wife. But when I saw the film and it had a connection between him losing his wife and losing his job, that's when the grief process really started to hit him, and he wanted help from the others. Is that what you were trying to convey to the audience?
Yeah, one part of it, and there's a metaphor for when he met his wife, his partner, in his job, and they're working on a project together. So from him losing the job and working on that project was him losing the lost connection to his wife. But he was looking at that, taking a step back from him, like he should be looking at his daughter as the connection to his wife, not the job. So, we sometimes in grief, we pick the things that feel more real to us when really the person in front of us, be it our family, be it our daughter, son, child, or whatever, is what we need to focus on. But grief can really do strange things to people, and it's just people coping it in different ways. But it's just a sad process, and that's what he believed was connection to his wife.
Yes, this film had a lot of different facets that can be connected to everyday life, which is what I like about this film. I think that you can pick and choose many different things from many different cultures that help to bring it to the point where we can all understand it and have a part to take in it. So, from the audience perspective, what do you think the audience should take away from this film?
For me, sometimes I like to, as you rightly said, to plant some seeds so that someone can take away from what they take away. Because when you create arts, your intention, which I can talk about, but let's say you write your intention and you make the film, you make your arts, whatever, and then once it's out in the ether, once it's out there, once someone views it, consumes it, the minute they process it, from your intention versus how they receive it can be quite different. But
Yeah.
overall, like, the pace of this film was quite slow and very meditative, and it's just a meditative study on grief, really. And it's all metaphors for my life of dealing with grief in the abstract and in the actual, you know, from losing family, friends as I've been aging, to losing things of significance that aren't living, but they do feel like life to me. So it's just that metaphor of grief, and not always making like the lead character, or some of the characters always have to be on like their best behavior. We want to show the facets of the personality in those situations. So I just wanted to take the realness, and sometimes you don't have to like Curtis, the lead character. Sometimes you can think, oh, he's done not the right decision and I'm not really feeling him right now. But someone else goes, you know what, I totally get that. I totally understand that. I don't agree with it, but I do understand it. So I just wanted to leave people question it and being on the fence to go either way.
Yeah, I think the way that it was approached is um, you had a contemplative period in between some of the wording and the sentences that were being drawn out by each of the actors in the film, which it didn't sound um, the way that it would give the opportunity for the audience to reflect and have some essence of the film itself. But right now, we know that uh, parents of Black children are really trying to um, coddle and bring up their children in a certain way because society is so out of normal. It's
Mhm.
hard to be a parent in today's society because of shootings and violence and everything around it. So I can understand from Curtis' respect, he's trying to bring his daughter up in the best way that he knows how in the beginning, but it takes a cohesive family in order to do that. That's mother, that's mother-in-law, father, and father-in-law in all respects. Um, Maternal health is such an important conversation in
Mm.
today's society as well. What parts of your film do you think speak out to us from the maternal health perspective?
Yeah, and because it was more subtle, I wasn't, you know, I mean, statistically in Black and Asian and or BIPOC communities, you're between 3 to 4 times likely to die during childbirth than your white counterpart. And people might go, is it genetics? It's this and that, and then there's a lot of more complexities to that than rather than the basic assumptions. So, for example, you know, doctors and nurses, and because my mom's Filipino, there's a strong the Filipino community has a lot of nurses in it,
Yes.
and like if some like imagine like if one of them, you know, a Filipino doesn't listen to the patient because they're like demanding something that goes, oh, they're too demanding, I'm not gonna listen to them, and then the doctor doesn't listen to them, and then all of a sudden they're in pain, and then all of a sudden they go through a trauma, and that contributes to that death statistic. I find that just disgusting, to be honest, because um, you know, we should be listening to our patients too, and but I know it's hard for healthcare professionals and whatnot to deal with all that. But I think the long and short of it, because the film doesn't talk about it real directly, it just talks about the impact. So with other documentaries that are out there and other films that talk about um, the actual insight into that death, it shows that picture. I just want to show that grieving picture of like the aftermath. And I mean, in situations like that, for example, when you know, the mother dies during childbirth, you know, there's a chance that the father remaining, or the parent left remaining with the child, may put the child up for adoption because they're not able to cope with that death and look after the kid at the same time. And and so it's a real tough decision, that can you carry on now that your support is gone. And some people have adopted their kid because it was best for the child, you know, for that, to set them up for their future, because they didn't know how long it's going to take for them to be able to raise their kids. So it just plants those initial thoughts, but rather than the direct, it doesn't go in a direct mission on that.
Yeah, I think your film has a indirectly definitely has an impact, and it sends a message. But from the audience perspective, they do have to pull out certain inferences and attach it to their own lives.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that is necessary and needed, instead of just blatantly coming out and giving the statistical advantages and disadvantages of mothers in maternal care right now. It's very difficult. And I think that, you know, us as parents do everything we can, but and put our lives in the hands of our doctors and nurses. And from that point on, you know, we really don't have the say that we really should have. And no one is really listening. So what do you think is the most important message that you want to share about your film?
I guess that's a good question, because I asked a few different questions that people can take from, which is what I did intend for this film. But I guess it does look at mental health, and I know that becomes particularly during the pandemic, as we start to explore, and exponentially mental health becomes a more prominent factor. I want this film for people just to reflect on their state, to reflect on their surroundings. And I think when you're in depressed states, it's so easy to feel so alone and to go into that hole and push people away. And then you expect them to be there for you in a very specific way, but then you end up pushing them away, but not acting in that specific way. So I think really it's just about, you know, when we recognize we're going into those paths and those moments, not necessarily through grief, but just through our day-to-day life, where it's starting to get us down. I just want people to stop and reflect, and to take a breath, to take a moment, to try and draw yourself back into the present, and then see if you can get help or not. Because Curtis didn't want help, and you know, he kept on pushing people away. And I think that's the analogy of you know, going into a dark place, that if you keep pushing people away, you're going to go further and further into that abyss. So I think that's kind of my message, is like, just stop and reflect, and to not go down that path if you can, because it does take a lot of strength to pull yourself out of those dark places.
Very good. Very well said. Again, I believe. So let's now talk with the director of How to Cure Insomnia. Please give us your name and a little bit about your film.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Khiam'e L.F. I'm the director for How to Cure Insomnia. And so a little bit about my background. I'm a director based out of Florida, specializing mainly in narrative, interpersonal drama, that sort of thing. So I'm really excited to talk about the film with you all today.
That's good to hear. I think that your film really struck a nerve with me. I have some kids, as I'm sure as a lot of us do. 17, is he about 17, the young man?
In the story, yeah, 17, 18, right on the cusp.
Yes, so he was still in high school, and they get headstrong and have a lot of, I don't want to call it indignation, but they have a very strong sense of self-worth and how to bring their voice across in groups.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that?
Yeah, I would agree. Speaking from a personal place as well, just being a teenager, as you mentioned, like I think everyone kind of goes through that phase of you're trying to find their voice, and sometimes the way it comes across might not necessarily be the way you intended.
I think that the way the mother was, to me, the lead character of this film,
Mm-hmm.
didn't have the support of the father, um, and she was kind of doing this on her own, is pretty much how uh, Black mothers of America uh, do life today. And the way she was raising her child was very typical as well. Would you say that?
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree, and I think definitely as you mentioned, like especially in America, it's a very difficult thing as always to raise a Black child, but also like when you're doing it without that extra support system there of having a partner or the other parent present there for whatever means, it becomes infinitely more challenging.
So it's very important to, um, if you can, have both in the house, but not necessary. The mother in the film, what was her name again?
Cynthia.
Cynthia. She was there was a part in the film where the son had on an albatross. Is that an albatross mask? What do they call that?
Well, it's like a plague doctor mask, which is a pretty uh yeah, it's what I called it was a plague doctor mask, which is like this sort of horned beat, like this sort of like beat mask that was really popular, or not really popular, but like really common during the bubonic plague and all that kind of stuff. About doctors will wear this mask, and there's like a whole history behind why they would wear it and what they
Right.
thought it would assist with. But yeah,
Tell us about that scene.
yeah. So I think the main thing about it is like what that mask is supposed to represent is like there is a sort of symbiosis between who the son is and um who the creature or who this other presence is with throughout the film. And so I think the main thing for me when I was sort of imagining that is like, once you've seen the mask, it's a very striking image, right? To see
Mhm.
this sort of being wearing this mask. And so yeah, like you mentioned, we see this moment of the son wearing that. That's kind of like the first moment we really kind of connect those two dots, connect those two beings in the film. And so I think for me what that sort of represented is like the mask is almost like, it's such a, like I said, such a striking figure, but also is very off-putting. Imagining seeing something sitting across from you wearing this like sort of like horror like figure, striking this horror like silhouette. And so when you see that moment where the son sort of reveals himself underneath the mask, it really is supposed to bridge that gap between what's horrifying and what's
Mhm.
reality. And so for me, that sort of revealing was supposed to it's supposed to really sort of like bridge those two things between what you fear the most and what you love the most. Like there's sometimes like a thin line between those things.
Is that what you think that was the most important piece in this film, or what would you? Because there was a lot of uh, parts in the movie to me that had the rebellion from the son, the mother was showing some anger in destroying the kitchen a little bit to show her frustration. And then her insomnia, which came out in the end, where she was waking up on the couch and the mother and son embrace and dance afterwards, which showed the connection to me that family is family. From your perspectives of being the director, what parts of this film did you deem most important?
Great question. So I think for me, the most important thing I think to take away is, for me, it feels very much like I really wanted to kind of go with the mom story, if that makes sense.
Mm,
Because for me, she really was the central character of this
mhm,
story. This story is really about her and what it represents. And then the
mhm,
second most important, as we kind of go through this journey with her. And then the other thing I wanted people to really kind of like take a moment in on is the actual mass figure himself itself, which is called the spook. And like there's all sorts of connotations that has within there, but like historically, like within just sort of like the historical context, or excuse me, contextual context.
mhm.
I think the most important thing for I wanted people to sort of feel, sort of realize is like, I when you're watching this film, or after you've had a moment to observe this film, I really want people to start asking questions, like question everything. And so for me, the story really is
Mm,
about us being in this perspective of this black mom who,
right,
like you mentioned, you had a great conversation. Ivan mentioned it as well, which is about like this thing of like, when you're a black parent, you do everything you can to raise your kids and to kind
right,
of put them in this protective circle or protective bubble. But at the end of the day, they have to get out and experience real life, for, sometimes for better or worse. And so the most important part for me in this film was just sort of having and being with the mom's journey. Because really what the film is, what I want the message of the film to get across is like, the story is called How to Cure Insomnia, right? And so,
yes.
like you mentioned, at the end, we see her waking up. And so, for me as the director, the what the sort of perspective is like, does she really have insomnia, or is it something else? And so, for
Mm,
me, as like what I was trying to convey was that it's not necessarily that she can't sleep because of this medical condition, but just from
uh-huh,
the condition of being a mother, you cannot sleep. Especially when your kid gets to be around that age, 17, 18, they get the license, they start going out with their friends. And we know how sometimes society responds to black and brown and other people of color, like, just existing out in the world and sort of the hardships and challenges they face. And so like the idea of it is, it's like, her insomnia, is trying to, so it's like the idea of like her insomnia is sort of trying to be being medically treated, but that's
yes,
not really the cause of why she can't sleep at night. And the cause for why she can't sleep at night is because she is a black mom. And so
right.
there's really no cure for that, right? There's really
That's
no
right.
cure for motherhood or parenthood, or like, it doesn't matter what age you get, your parents will always worry about you and they'll always care about you. And so where that ties in with the spook character, which is the mask figure, and again, like you mentioned, like with that reveal for between the spook and the sun, it's like this
Yes.
idea of like the spook is sort of like a manifestation of
Uh-huh.
all the negative emotions, trauma, energy that she sort of feels, all the sort of anxiety and panic that she sort of feels, and it's like reflected in this sort of character, which only she can interact with, or only she can see. And then in that moment when it's sort of like you see the son's face under the mask, is kind of like ties into like, wow, so all those negative emotions and fears, they're sort of tied into this, to the son in that sense. And so to answer, to mainly like some of your question, yeah, I think the main thing about it is like, the most important part about the story is like just understanding and empathizing with this mother's journey, but
Mm,
also understanding and empathizing with sort of like the idea that the we're starting the film like talking about like, is there a cure for why she's staying up at night? And at the end, I hope the message is that no, there isn't a cure for it, because it's not something that can be medically treated, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It plagues Black families all over America, and it brings this whole story home. And everything that you just said is just so relatable to Black families, Black mothers and fathers. So I just want to ask you this one last question. From my own perspective, as a parent of Black children, how do we stop feeling so uneasy when our child steps out the door?
That's a very great question, and I think that's something that, to be quite honest, I'm not sure the answer to as well. And I'm sure, like, just thinking on that idea from, my perspective of around the time when I started to really get into, adulthood or the college, sort of that transition from high school to college, from like being like, under your parents' wing to like actually being an adult, was around the time the Trayvon Martin incident happened. And like I'm
Mhm.
from Florida, and so I was actually going to
God
attend
bless
school. Yeah, exactly. Like I was actually going to attend school not far from where Trayvon was unfortunately unalived, or rather killed, to be quite frank. And so, like, how do you get rid of the anxiety? I think the only way that can happen is if society itself changes, because we've seen at every level, it doesn't matter, what your family's background is, what your status is, especially as black parents and black children. It's like your parents could have like a millions of dollars in net worth, or they can just be like a, an average working family. It doesn't matter. Nobody
you.
asks what you do or what your background is. uh, if they see you out on the street. If they see you out on the street, unfortunately, society weaponizes blackness, and they don't
Yes.
ask those kind of questions. And so, for a parent, who is, for parents who do feel that way, and like that's really the inspiration for the film, is like, during all these things were happening, and I'm just like, for me, the film was sort of like an introspective of like, we all know about the Black Lives Matter movement. I just really wanted to sort of explore it from like a parent's point of view, in the sense of what is it like to spend 18, 20, however many years of your life, 9 months carrying a child, 18 months raising that child, and putting all your love and your resources and your energy into this other human being, just for somebody on the outside to just look at your kid and just think like, oh, they're a thug, or oh, there's something to be feared, they're a threat to me, and I
And
even feel like they have the authority to infringe upon this being's life. And like for me, that's like the biggest question that I wanted to try to explore myself with the film, was like you were saying, like, how do you stop that sort of anxiety? And I think the answer is you can't, because until society starts to change and shift the way it weaponizes blackness and, other communities of color, it's still a question we're going to be going and living through.
mhm.
But I would just like to briefly say, like, this why for me the ending was so important, to
Mhm.
have that moment of joy and escape, and
Yes.
like together intimacy between mother and son, because it's like at the end of the day, you're going through all these hardships and you're facing all these challenges, but at the end of the day, being able to have a moment and just dancing with your child
Yes.
or with your parent, just being able
Yeah.
to have that moment is what makes those challenges worth it. Just being able to see, having that intimate, joyful moment with your loved one.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. I think ending with that scene in your film was a moving, touching. It really brought it all home, and it was definitely uh, a great ending to that film, because it could have ended much different.
Right.
So I more want to thank you, and thank the director uh, from Pattern today. We had Pattern and How to Cure Insomnia on film. We want to thank all of our Roxbury audience for coming to view the film.